We are conditioned to believe that history is the exclusive product of military power, the result of vast armies and the generals who command them. By 1939, the German war machine appeared invincible, moving across the European continent with a momentum that logic suggested could not be stopped. Conventional wisdom says that defeating such a force requires years of elite training, massive industrial output, and a network of skilled operatives. But the greatest intelligence failure of the Second World War wasn't caused by a rival military. It was the work of a man who failed at almost everything he touched. Juan Pujol García lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Spain. To any passerby, he was just another struggling civilian. His record of military service during the Spanish Civil War was characterized by reluctance and a total lack of aptitude. He followed this with a string of professional disasters. He was an ineffective hotel manager and a failed poultry farmer who couldn't keep his business out of the mud. He entered the 1940s with no connections, no formal training in intelligence, and no discernible skills in statecraft. This total lack of a profile became his primary advantage. German intelligence agencies were looking for high-level threats, and Pujol's simply didn't exist in their world. Beneath his unremarkable exterior, Pujol held a visceral hatred for the totalitarian regimes sweeping across Europe. He also possessed an inventive, almost chaotic imagination that allowed him to see possibilities where others saw only failure. He decided to combine his political conviction with his creative streak to build a tool that the German military wasn't prepared to defend against. From a small room in a country he couldn't leave, this failed businessman decided he would take down the Third Reich on his own terms. Because the German Abwehr was trained to identify organized professional movements, they were blind to a single civilian acting without a predictable pattern. Pujol constructed a phantom network, a sprawling web of fictitious subagents. He fed imaginary high-quality reports to the Germans, building credibility. He didn't use classified files. He used a tourist guide, a railway map, and a public library to ground his lies. His lack of formal training meant he didn't use the standard codes or behaviors that Allied or Axis counterintelligence expected, making his trail impossible to follow. He invented entire divisions of soldiers and moved them across the map, creating a secondary, fictional version of the war that the Germans accepted as fact. The Nazi high command allocated fuel, diverted vital transport, and reassigned personnel to counter a threat that Pujol had typed into existence on a borrowed typewriter. Pujol had finally realized that an army can be neutralized by forcing it to mobilize against a phantom. The German intelligence machine relied on rigid, hierarchical logic. This structure made them extremely effective at processing data, but vulnerable to a single creative outlier. They operated on the assumption that any significant threat would be an organized military one, ignoring the possibility that a civilian could manipulate their entire strategy. By the time they realized their data was flawed, Pujol's fictional world had already been integrated into the highest levels of German strategic planning. The German high command possessed the firepower to win, but they lacked the institutional imagination to see they were being toyed with by an amateur. This manufactured network eventually became the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude, a massive deception that kept German divisions away from Normandy on D-Day. His reports diverted reinforcements at the most critical moment of the invasion, directly contributing to the Allied breakthrough in France. The orders that moved tens of thousands of Nazi soldiers away from the front lines began here, in the mud of a failed poultry farm. History is often measured in battalions and borders, but Juan Pujol showed that the outcome of a world war can hinge on the imagination of a single, unremarkable civilian. In the middle of the Second World War, an unassuming Spanish civilian named Juan decided he needed to get involved. He had no military background, but he was determined to fight. His initial plan was straightforward. He simply walked through the busy streets of Madrid, approached the British embassy, and offered to volunteer as a spy for the Allies. The professional intelligence officers saw a man with no formal training who presented his offer with an intensity that felt more like theater than professional espionage. To them, he looked less like an asset and more like an unpredictable security risk. They showed him the door, rejecting his offer 3 separate times. The direct route had failed. Juan stopped trying to convince the British embassy and started looking for a lateral path, one that didn't require their permission to get started. His new strategy was a complete pivot. If the Allies wouldn't hire him, he would manipulate the German military intelligence, the Abwehr, into hiring him instead. He constructed a persona as a Spanish government official with fanatical pro-Nazi sympathies, claiming his work required frequent travel to London. He managed to secure a meeting with German operatives, and they accepted his cover story without hesitation. The Abwehr handed him the tools of the trade, a crash course in field espionage, a specialized codebook, and invisible ink. They also provided a significant financial stake, handing over $3,000 in cash to fund his network. His official orders were clear: travel directly to England and begin recruiting a network of sub-agents. By the time he left that meeting, Juan had secured exactly what the British had denied him: professional training and thousands of dollars in operational funding, all courtesy of the German military. But Juan faced a problem his new handlers hadn't noticed. He didn't have a visa to enter Britain, and he couldn't speak a word of English. Instead of attempting to cross the English Channel, he bought a train ticket to a neutral location. He relocated to Lisbon, Portugal, establishing a new base of operations far from his intended target. He was now an official German operative, fully funded and equipped, yet he was stranded in a neutral port, with no way to reach the country he was supposed to be infiltrating. The deadline was approaching. The Abwehr expected regular intelligence dispatches from their agent in London, and Juan had nothing to report. Locked in his Lisbon hotel room, he decided that if he couldn't observe British military activity, he would simply manufacture it. He gathered a handful of mundane civilian resources: a map of the UK, a blue tourist guidebook, and a public library card. Using a mechanical typewriter, he began drafting highly detailed reports about military movements that didn't exist. He took ordinary data from train schedules and regional maps and systematically translated them into convincing reports on troop logistics and troop strength. He began transmitting these fabricated stories back to the German High Command, creating an entire network of imaginary sub-agents that existed only on paper. Juan hadn't relied on state secrets or actual field access. He had used a hotel room and a few library books to manufacture a simulation of wartime Britain that the German High Command accepted as fact. From a quiet hotel room, Juan is meticulously brushing invisible ink across a train timetable. To make the document look like it has traveled all the way across Europe, he carefully ages the edges with cheap tea. He is drafting an urgent intelligence report detailing British troop movements massing near London. This is the kind of highly classified military data that dictates the defense strategy of the Third Reich. If his handlers in the German High Command catch even a hint of a lie, the consequences are deadly. You do not feed false military intelligence to the Nazi war machine and expect to survive. But there is a massive geographical flaw in Juan's operation. He is not stationed in a grim, war-torn London flat. He is sitting in a hotel room over 1,000 miles away, looking out at the sunny streets of Lisbon, Portugal. A lone operative isolated in a neutral country cannot realistically track the movements of an entire island nation. If Juan is going to survive this deception, he needs backup. He has to invent a ghost army to do the spying for him. Before he can start feeding the Germans fake intelligence on a massive scale, Juan has to solve a basic logistical puzzle. How is a man living in Portugal supposedly getting physical letters out of the United Kingdom? He solves it by inventing his very first sub-agent. He tells the Germans he has recruited a KLM airline pilot who flies regular commercial routes, allowing him to quietly smuggle the reports across borders. The pilot explains the courier route, but the German High Command immediately demands a wider scope of intelligence. They want eyes across the entire British Isles, far beyond what one imaginary pilot can see. So Juan drafts another life. He creates a Venezuelan national living in Glasgow, motivated by a deep hatred for the British, who can supposedly report on northern naval shipyards. Next, he invents some unstable, unpredictable British soldier stationed near the Liverpool docks to feed him direct military chatter from the western ports. The lie is growing, and with it comes an incredible administrative burden. Juan is now managing multiple imaginary people, tracking their specific handwriting styles, their financial troubles, and their unique personalities. His daily routine turns into an exhausting schedule of roleplay. He writes distinct letters in the voice of each fake operative, meticulously ensuring that none of their fictional timelines or geographic movements contradict one another. The entire operation holds together because Juan understands human nature. He knows that perfect spies look suspicious, so he carefully engineers verifiable flaws and habits into every ghost he creates. Juan eventually realizes these fictional character flaws provide a way to siphon real wealth from the Reich. The network's weaknesses are actually his greatest financial asset. If one of his fake spies catches a fictional illness or requires surgery, Juan writes to his handlers requesting extra funds to cover the medical bills. The Nazis, eager to keep their operatives healthy, happily pay up. But the sprawling network eventually triggers a massive crisis. Juan misses a critical reporting deadline on a piece of requested intelligence, and the German handlers start asking dangerous questions. To kill the investigation before it starts, Juan resorts to extreme measures. He fabricates the sudden, tragic death of the specific agent responsible for the late report. He feeds the Germans a highly detailed, dramatic account of the operative's demise, making sure to mention that the man left behind a grieving, financially ruined widow. The German high command buys the story without hesitation. They are so moved by the loss of their valuable asset that they agree to pay an ongoing monthly pension to a widow who does not even exist. Those recurring payments act as the perfect shield. By officially recognizing and compensating the fake widow, the Germans inadvertently validate the dead agent, burying any questions about the missed deadline. The German intelligence bureaucracy is entirely blinded by their desperate need for information. They are so committed to the illusion that they willingly finance the fallout of a man who existed only on paper. Over the course of 2 years, that initial handful of fake operatives expands into a massive, tightly controlled espionage ring. Juan now manages 27 distinct, totally fictional human beings, all without ever leaving his quiet Lisbon hotel room. Meanwhile, across the channel, the highest levels of the German military are shifting real-world troop formations and altering strategic priorities based entirely on the observations of ghosts. A terrifying, continent-spanning intelligence apparatus is being completely derailed by one isolated man armed with nothing more than train timetables, invisible ink, and a few drops of tea. Juan's operation proved that defeating a massive military machine does not necessarily require matching their firepower. You just need to figure out exactly what your enemy is desperate to believe, and then write the script for them. In 1942, the underground intelligence bunkers in London were in a state of sheer panic. British operatives had tapped into enemy communication lines and were listening to a steady, alarming flow of secret German radio traffic. The transcripts coming across their desks contained highly precise, highly accurate details about British troop movements, information that should have been completely inaccessible to the Axis powers. Looking at the sheer volume and accuracy of these reports, MI5 reached a terrifying conclusion. There had to be a massive, highly coordinated Nazi spy ring operating straight out of the UK, completely undetected. The agency poured resources into tracking down this phantom network, tearing the country apart to find the leak. But after months of frantic searching, they found absolutely nothing. Not a single spy, not a single transmitter. By mid-1942, this invisible spy network had successfully diverted vital resources away from real threats, forcing British intelligence to chase shadows across the country. But the real source of those intercepts wasn't in a dark alleyway in London. It was here, on the sunny civilian streets of Lisbon, Portugal. When British intelligence finally unraveled the mystery, they realized there was no massive German spy ring. The entire operation was a complete fabrication, engineered by a single Spanish man named Juan. Juan was running this entire psychological operation without a single military asset. He was doing it out of a bright, peaceful public library. Day after day, he sat at those tables, using standard travel guides, train schedules, and reference books to invent entirely fake military units and troop movements. He typed them up, sent them off, and the German High Command accepted every word of his fiction as absolute fact. Juan's solo hustle exposed a critical vulnerability in the German intelligence machine. They possessed a fatal inability to distinguish verified hard data from meticulously researched, highly plausible fiction. When MI5 realized they spent months chasing ghosts created by I with a library card, they didn't arrest him. They were completely in awe of his deceptive genius. They immediately launched an extraction operation, putting him on a ship and bringing him safely to England in 1942. Instead of shutting him down, MI5 officially recruited him. They took this rogue civilian and transformed him into a state-sponsored double agent. Because of his ability to spin such convincing lies, his handlers gave him a new official codename, Garbo, calling him the greatest actor in the world. With Juan officially on the payroll, British intelligence transitioned from merely listening to the war to actively writing its script. Now operating out of London, Garbo was paired with MI5 handler Thomas Harris. Suddenly, his fictional network was backed by the full administrative power of the British military. Together, they deployed a tactic known as the noise strategy, which focused on overwhelming German analysts by flooding their communication channels with a constant stream of massive data. We start with a central node representing Garbo, splitting into hundreds of rapidly multiplying communication lines. This massive output of complex transmissions completely drowned German intelligence in a sea of beautifully designed, strategically useless information. This had a direct, devastating impact on German intelligence. They were forced to dedicate massive amounts of time and manpower just to translate, decode, and attempt to verify all this fake data, effectively paralyzing their actual operations. Ultimately, Garbo proved that a sophisticated intelligence agency can be effectively neutralized simply by drowning its attention in a brilliant, undeniable fiction. By June 1944, the Allies had assembled the largest armada in human history off the coast of England. Thousands of ships idled in the mist, preparing to cross the English Channel and punch through the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. A massive tactical flaw threatened the entire operation. If the German High Command correctly anticipated the landing site at Normandy, they could concentrate their artillery and destroy the Allied force before it ever reached the sand. Their survival depended on a massive diversion. The Allies had to convince the German High Command to mass their defensive forces at a completely different location, a beach called Pas de Calais. This map shows the spatial reality of that lie. Normandy and Pas de Calais sit 150 miles apart, a geographic gap the Germans would have to defend if the bluff worked. Achieving this required deceiving a military apparatus that was heavily fortified and deeply entrenched and notoriously paranoid about enemy infiltration. Defeating the physical defenses of the Atlantic Wall required a psychological weapon capable of breaking the enemy's chain of command. The most vital asset in this mission was a lone spy, and a former chicken farmer named Juan. Juan's strategy to manipulate the enemy defied all conventional espionage logic. To ensure the invasion's success, Juan keyed his radio in the dead of night and transmitted the genuine, exact coordinates of the D-Day landings directly to Hitler's high command. Handing the enemy the exact location of your attack was a terrifying gamble, but it was the only way to guarantee their eventual defeat. A paranoid high command does not simply accept high-level invasion plans from a single source. Juan spent years establishing a baseline of immense intelligence value to Berlin. He flooded German military intelligence with reports generated by a network of 27 completely fabricated subagents. This overwhelming volume of consistent, high-quality data conditioned the Germans to rely on Juan's network over all other intelligence channels. By dominating the enemy's intelligence ecosystem, Juan effectively became their sole source of reality. Just hours before the first troops hit the beaches, Juan sent the first half of his masterstroke, the real coordinates of Normandy. Urgent. The physical invasion launched in real time as the German command decoded his message, proving his information was perfect. The intelligence arrived too late for the Germans to physically redeploy their tanks, but it acted as undeniable proof of Juan's absolute accuracy. Following this display of precision, the German High Command's reliance on Juan turned into blind, unquestioning faith. 2 days later, while the Allied foothold was still fragile, Juan deployed the second half of his trap. He sent an urgent message claiming that the Normandy landing was merely a distraction. He told Hitler that the real, massive invasion was still coming to Pas-de-Calais and urged him to hold his divisions in place. Juan used the truth of the first message as the currency to buy absolute belief in the reality-altering lie of the second. Hitler capitulated immediately to Juan's false narrative, trusting the radio reports over the reports from his own front lines. Personally overriding his generals, the Führer ordered 2 armored divisions and 19 infantry divisions to remain locked down at Pas-de-Calais. Thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks sat idle, waiting for an army of ghosts while the actual war was being decided 150 miles away. While the German army waited for an attack that would never come, the Allies successfully secured the Normandy beachhead and began the liberation of Europe. Hitler's own command effectively neutralized the most lethal portion of the German defense. A traditional breakthrough requires thousands of tanks and lives. Juan achieved the same strategic outcome with a single radio transmission. Weaponizing an enemy's perception yields a higher strategic return than any physical weapon. This is the power of trust asymmetry. The ultimate masterstroke of war is earning enough of an enemy's trust to make them completely paralyze their own army. On June 6, 1944, the success of the Normandy invasion rested on a deception maintained by a single Spaniard. His work redirected German panzer divisions away from the beaches, saving the Allied landing and the future of Western Europe. Yet his story ended in total obscurity. Just 4 years after the war, in 1948, reports reached London that he had contracted malaria in Angola and died. All global intelligence agencies accepted the report. The wartime maps were rolled up, his files were archived, and the name Juan Pujol García disappeared from history. That story remained the official record until 1984, when a persistent British historian began tracking leads that suggested the report from Angola was a lie. He discovered that the man was alive. He was living a quiet, mundane life, running a bookstore and teaching language classes in the capital of Venezuela. For 36 years, the world's intelligence services, the very people who had employed him, believed that Agent Garbo was dead. And this raises a very central question. Why would the most successful spy of the 20th century choose to erase his own existence at the height of his achievement? To understand his disappearance, we have to look at the wartime deception he created. It was so detailed that the German High Command had no reason to doubt it. Juan had won their absolute trust. In July 1944, Adolf Hitler personally authorized a high-level commendation for his services to the Third Reich. Juan received the news via a radio message signed by the Führer himself, awarding him the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military honor. This created a dangerous paradox. He was now so highly valued by Berlin that any slight inconsistency in his daily reports would immediately expose him as a double agent, leading to his execution. Months after the German award, the British government moved to recognize where his true loyalty lay. King George VI awarded him the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. Juan Pujol García became the only man in the Second World War to be highly decorated by both sides of the conflict. When the war ended, his German handlers still believed he was a loyal Nazi. Juan fully realized that as long as he existed, he was a target for post-war fascist networks seeking violent revenge. To survive his own success, he authored one final fiction. He staged his death from malaria and vanished into South America. In 1984, Juan stepped out of the shadows and traveled back to the streets of London. He was met with tears by his surviving MI5 colleagues, who had spent decades believing their friend had died in Africa. They took him to France for a final tour of the Normandy beaches, allowing him to stand on the ground he had protected through his work in the shadows. Having finally received public recognition, he returned to Caracas and passed away peacefully under his true name in 1988. The Second World War is often remembered for its industrial scale and massive armies, but its most vital deception came from a man of humble origins. He never fired a weapon in anger or commanded a single soldier. He began the war as a failed chicken farmer who simply wanted to do his part. His equipment consisted of a tourist guidebook, a typewriter, and a capacity for invention that fooled the most sophisticated military machine on Earth. Working in a solitary room, he used those simple tools to redirect the course of the war. A masterful fiction had saved the Allied landing. Looking at the face of Juan Pujol García, we see the man who used his imagination to rewrite the history of the modern world.